see you all. Happy late March already, which is a stunner. I'm glad that you all are here, you joining us online. Let's start by just making sure we're all clear that a week from Sunday is Palm Sunday. And the beginning of Holy Week, it is already here. And so I hope that you all are planning to join us. We've got Palm Sunday, a week from Sunday, Easter Sunday, the week after that. But Holy Week is one of those really excellent opportunities for us to worship and reflect in a totally unique way. We've got a whole series of worship services beginning on Wednesday night, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Those are services we only do once a year. And so something that I've said in years past, and so I'll just plant the seed now, at some point, I would love for you to go through the Thursday, Friday, Saturday trio of services, Monday, Thursday, Good Friday, and the Easter Vigil, all in the same year. And so if you can this year, do it. If you can't this year, just put that in your pocket and do it at some point. Make a plan to actually do all three of those services. It's called the Triduum, or the Paschal Triduum. They're meant to tell the story of Jesus' passion and resurrection all together. And when you do all three, it's a really remarkable experience. Any one of them is great. So if there's one you like and you always go to that one, just go to that one, that's fine. But if there's a year, this year or some year, where you could do all three, I highly commend it to you, because I think you will find that it is time really well spent, super unique, very interesting, and are totally connected to one another. And so there's my pitch for Holy Week. But of course, Easter Sunday. Easter Sunday is the big fun thing. So we've got Palm Sunday a week from Sunday, Easter Sunday 2 weeks from Sunday, and then Easter is not a day, Easter is a season. And so Easter Sunday starts the great 50 days of Easter. And so don't just come on Easter and be done. That's not it. Easter Sunday is just the first Sunday of Easter. And so we hope you will plug in and keep with us all through that season. You can visit our website and get all the information. My Friday email letters have links to all the worship service schedules that they will be in the bulletin this week and then the following week. And so grab a magazine on your way out. We've got all the schedules for everything coming up. Lots of them will be live streamed, but the majority will not be. And so do check. It's all noted in the schedule which ones will be live streamed and which ones will not be. And so with that announcement, a reminder that I like questions, so send them to me. You all must have been on spring break last week because we did not get any questions, which is just fine. But if you've got them today, prepare yourself, or online, and Bub will be monitoring that. And if you do not get Bub's email, sign up today or send a note online and we'll make sure you're added. Let's say a prayer and jump in. The Lord be with you. Amen. Let us pray. Gracious God, as we near the end of this Lenten season, we ask your continued blessings upon us. Help us to empty ourselves out so we can make space for your Spirit to fill us up. As we study your word today, may it continue to work to transform us day by day, draw us closer to you, and help us to be courageous enough to spread your love to everyone we meet. Hold all those that we have in our hearts and minds, those who need your healing touch, those who need your peace, those who may be near the end of their lives, and those we love and see no longer. May they all feel your presence and be uplifted by your love and your grace and our prayers and our support. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so today we're looking at 1 Kings, chapters 3 and 4. We are now into Solomon's rule. And so we only have a few more weeks left of this study. I want to say 5 maybe in total, because we do not meet during Holy Week. And so with those 5 weeks left, we're really kind of closing up that kingdom period after David. So a couple weeks on Solomon, and then at least a week or two on essentially the devolving of the kingdoms altogether into the exile. And so first, let's start with Solomon is now actually king. And after David's death, which we looked at a couple weeks ago, Solomon takes the throne. And the very first thing we see Solomon do is make a wise political move. And so 1 Kings chapter 3, let's look at just the first couple verses. Chapter 3, verse 1. Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. So let's just stop there. There's not much said about this, but the very first thing we hear about Solomon as king is he makes a political alliance with Egypt. Now, I think all of us looking at this would say, that is pretty wise. He is not a stupid guy. Egypt is much bigger than Israel, and Egypt is much more powerful than Israel. We've talked a lot about how Israel was essentially a little land bridge between the North and East African nations that are much bigger and the Central Asian nations, particularly Babylon, Persia, and the ones that are much bigger. Israel's not that big, but it does sit on a nice little piece of land that everybody needs for trade. And so in order to gain some protection from one of their big neighbors, Solomon marries off with one of Pharaoh's daughters. Now, a few comments about this marriage. First off, we might read this and think that that was very calculated and cold. Even in the Old Testament, we get a few little moments of actual love/desire for marriage. But most of the time, in the Old Testament, really most of the time until the 20th century, marriage was just a business deal. It was two families who needed to associate with one another, or two individuals who saw a benefit in actually being married, whether that was to bear children, that was to combine property, that was to create an alliance, whatever that was. Marriages were really about business. It's only in recent history, modern history, that marriage has leaned into love. I think today we probably have more marriages based on love, but let's not fool ourselves. There are still plenty of marriages based on business. And so, or many marriages that might have started with love and they kept on because of business. And so this idea that Solomon is using marriage for a good business reason is not something unusual. Number two, we know from the prophets that trusting in one's own ability is a fast way to separate from God. It's very consistent that the prophets in the Old Testament point to trusting yourself more than trusting God. That is the root of our human problems. What is interesting about that is here Solomon goes, essentially trusting himself. Now, could it be that left unsaid or unwritten here is that God directed Solomon to go marry an Egyptian princess? Sure, maybe. But that's not noted here. And so many other things are noted here that they probably would not have left that out. And so it's most likely that Solomon is just simply strategic. But Solomon's strategy is based on his own intelligence, his own political leanings, not his relationship with God. That could potentially cause him some trouble. We know throughout all of the Old Testament, relying on your own wit is how you get in the most trouble. That is essentially the difference between Saul and David. Saul did not make as many mistakes as David, but Saul made mistakes because Saul relied on himself. David made mistakes and immediately returned to God. And so therefore Saul, even with his simpler mistakes, is not elevated theologically as much as David, who continued to return and repent with God. Number three, marrying a foreign woman, that's not what you're supposed to do. And already at this point in Jewish history, that is very clear. Think back to Jacob and Esau. Esau went off and married a foreign wife. And so Jacob was sent back home, back to the real people, to go find the blue blood so that he could marry the right woman. He ends up marrying multiple women, but regardless, marrying the right person is important. Solomon going off, not only marrying just someone who's not an Israelite, but someone who is a leader, a royal of a foreign government, a foreign power, means that he's going to be mixing in a lot of the foreign stuff into the Jewish world. It's problematic not only because it thins out the bloodline, so to speak, but it's also because of what that foreign person brings into the home. wrong. So here we have a princess of Egypt. So almost certainly we can assume she's bringing a whole bunch of stuff with her. And that stuff is going to include all of the Egyptian religious iconography and idols and worship practices and all this stuff. Now, even if the marriage is something that's totally political and they're not going to really associate with one another very much, and she's going to have her own little wing of the palace, in that wing of the palace, she's going to have a bunch of statues. And she's going to have an altar to the Egyptian gods. We hear nothing about her becoming Jewish, and almost certainly she would not have become Jewish. She would have brought all of her Egyptian stuff with her. Well, bringing that inside the house, under one roof, means that you begin to show people alternate ways of being. You begin to show people alternate ways of worshiping, and worshiping multiple gods instead of Yahweh alone. All of that amounts to a very complicated single verse to begin Solomon's kingship. So any questions about that before we get into Solomon's ask? Yes?
Well, he was supposed to be so wise. So why would he do these things? Might that be detrimental?
So Solomon's supposed to be so wise. Why would he do things that were detrimental? We will get to Solomon's wisdom relationship with God next, but I don't think Solomon is unwise for making a strategic decision. I think that one of the things we have to hold, I think, in tension here is nothing is ever fully right or fully wrong. It's always a give and take and a balance and decision points. I think Solomon, to give him the benefit of the doubt, Solomon likely understood that there were good things he could do, but he had to make sure he secured Israel first. Like, you can't grow the economy, you can't create a good social order, you can't create opportunities for your people if you're constantly worried about being attacked by a power that is much bigger than you. And so if he prioritized Israel's security by making an alliance with Egypt, that might be an imperfect, even relatively bad decision that allows him to make a lot of really good decisions in the future. And so one could say that being a purist, where you only ever do the absolute right thing, is almost untenable. Not only is there's never really an absolute right thing to do, first off, but the world is just too complicated for that. And so I read this as not necessarily Solomon did the wrong thing, but Solomon is doing a complicated thing. And we often imagine Solomon as being this perfectly wise person. We get verse 1 of Solomon's kingship shows us that is not actually the case. Wise, yes. But all good? Not all good. But perhaps on balance good? In the aggregate good? Sure. But nobody's perfect. And this opens up some doors that may or may not be problematic for him in the future. He may not know. But perhaps he's willing to take that risk for a much bigger reward, and that the reward would outweigh the risk. Other thoughts or questions? All right, now let's get to the story we all know about Solomon. Verse 3. I'm just going to read a bit here, all the way through. Now Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David. Only he sacrificed and offered incense at the high places. The king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the principal high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask what I should give you." And Solomon said, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant, my father David, because he walked before you in faithfulness and righteousness and in uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne today. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, although I am only a little child. I do not know how to go in or come out. And your servant is in the midst of the people whom you have chosen, a great people, so numerous they cannot be numbered or counted. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil, for who can govern this your great people? Now it pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. God said to him, because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life or riches, or for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, I now do according to your word. Indeed, I give you a wise and discerning mind. No one like you has been before you, and no one like you shall arise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor all your life. No other king shall compare with you. If you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your life. And we'll stop there. I think this exchange between Solomon and God is totally fascinating because Solomon seems to be already super clever. So Solomon is already wise enough that when God comes to him in a dream, which we assume because of the way the story is told is legitimate, like God's actually speaking to Solomon, even though the story says it's in a dream, that he knows what to ask God for. God says, what do you want? Almost as if, I'll give you anything. And I hear that and I think that's a trick. But who knows? Maybe God was legitimately saying, I'll give you whatever you want. But Solomon was wise enough to ask for a discerning mind, to ask for wisdom. Now, he's obviously not dumb. We found out from the very first verse of chapter 3 that Solomon is wise enough to make political alliances to keep Israel safe. And so when God comes here, Solomon is, in a sense, wise enough to ask God for wisdom. And perhaps why would he ask God for wisdom if he was already wise? Well, maybe it's because he suspects what God said is what God would say. And so Solomon asks for wisdom, and God says, well, my, you are such a good guy. And because you didn't ask for riches or for long life, but wisdom, I'm going to give it all to you. Now, how many of you think Solomon may have thought God would do that in the first place? It reminds me of sort of like a child. You know, whenever a child has this epiphany when the parent is talking with them and they say exactly the right thing, they are definitely not actually just saying the right thing. They are figuring out what the parent thinks is the right thing, because not only will they say the right thing and the parent will be happy, but they're going to get something extra for it as well later on. Oh yes, Dad, I would love a side of broccoli because later I will get a bigger ice cream, right? I mean, we understand how this works. And I kind of see Solomon knowing something about God's nature, such that if he doesn't ask for the stuff humans might ask for, God may end up being even more generous than he was in the first place. In addition, I want to bring up what I find most fascinating about this exchange. Solomon wants a discerning mind to know the difference between good and evil. Okay, now let's pause there. Good and evil, the knowledge of good and evil, that is not just right and wrong, or else they may have said it in different words. When did we first hear about the knowledge between good and evil? In the garden with Adam and Eve. Okay, so this is very interesting. Solomon would have absolutely known that story. And so the way this story is being told here, Solomon's not just asking to be just, or to be smart, or strategic, or even to know right from wrong. Solomon wants to have the knowledge of good and evil. So why would Solomon actually ask for what God told Adam and Eve they could not get? And so let's play with this idea first. God says to Adam and Eve in the garden, they should not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God does not say you cannot know the difference between good and evil. Why then would God have said you can't eat that fruit to learn the difference between good and evil? And then here we have a story of Solomon, where Solomon asks God for the knowledge between good and evil. The way I take this is that Adam and Eve sought to learn the knowledge between good and evil from the world. Solomon is asking to know the knowledge between good and evil from God. God obviously said to Adam and Eve, you can't learn the difference out in the world. But they tried anyway. And here we have Solomon going to God and asking to know the difference between good and evil from God directly. And God says yes. So what this tells me is that God is not interested in keeping us from knowing the difference between good and evil. God wants us to go to Him to determine the difference between good and evil. That's really subtle, and it's super important. We often go into the world to determine what is right or wrong, or good or evil, rather than going to God and determining what is right and wrong, or good and evil. Just think. Okay, ready? I want this to make you uncomfortable. Ready? So just open yourself up. Take a deep breath. We're going to all get uncomfortable. Here we go. What in your life occupies energy that you think you know what is right and wrong, what is good or not good, what the world should or should not do, what you or your neighbors or your fellow parishioners should or should not do? We are all in some way working out right and wrong, good and bad, should not. And mostly, what we think is right or wrong, or good or bad, is because of what the world is telling us. And by the world, I mean other people, specifically nowadays, pundits, who like to wax very much about what we should or should not do. Politicians who talk all the time about what we should or should not do. Articles that you read, things that are shared with you online, neighbors who tell you over tea, whatever. The world comes at us constantly, telling us what is good and bad and right or wrong and what we should or should not do. How often do we actually check all of that with what God tells us? If we're honest, the answer is probably never or hardly ever. Because we are so very certain, in one way or the other, that we are pretty decent, that we are faithful, that we already love Jesus and love God. And so we then have it in us to determine what is right or wrong based on how we experience the world. This section right here tells us that's not exactly true. Instead, when we go out into the world to figure out what is right or wrong, or good or evil, we're going to fail. But when we go to God to find out what is right or wrong, or good or evil, we'll actually be doing the best for ourselves and for our friends and our family and the world in general. This is a really challenging idea, mostly because as Christians, we choose to follow Jesus, and Jesus is not very specific. And we don't like that. I say it all the time. Jesus is inconvenient. Mostly Jesus is inconvenient because Jesus is not specific. And so when Jesus says love your neighbor, Jesus does not tell you how, or when not to. Jesus does not say anything more than to love. Well, that is super problematic when your neighbor's a jerk. Or when your neighbor thinks differently than you, or when your neighbor wants different things in the world than you. Jesus doesn't say only love the people who agree with you, or live like you, or look like you, or act like you. Jesus says love your neighbor. That's it. And if that's our message from God, and we know that God tells us what is right or wrong, not the world, then much of what causes rancor in our world today has nothing to do with God. Regardless of the words people use, regardless of religious language that people use, regardless of people calling out about God, that is nothing to do with God. I think I am done with that. So, thoughts or comments or questions about that before I'm not quite done with this whole wisdom piece, but I want you to receive that last few minutes with the weight it really has. Psychologically, we desire so much to be right. It is a principal defining characteristic of humanity because we don't want to be wrong. And so we often convince ourselves of our rightness by surrounding ourselves with people who agree with us. That kind of construct in the world not only creates echo chambers where we aren't thinking critically or discerning critically, but it also makes us afraid over time of the people who are unlike us, who think differently than us, who choose to live differently than us. And that fear is it. Fear is the prime motivator. Fear will get people to do anything. And when we let fear begin to be the foundation of our being, we really don't even have the capacity to think about the way in which we see the world as being potentially different than the way God wishes us to see it. I mean, my guess is that many, maybe most of us in this room have trouble even beginning to think about the way we see the world as not being the way God wishes us to see the world. And that's mostly because fear can have such a grip on who we are and how we act and what we think, that it takes real courage and strength and intention to break away from what has likely formed us over years or decades. Most of us in this room have been formed over decades and decades so that we are who we are right now, and we think the way we think, and we see the way we see. That's really hard to break out of. All I want us to be willing to do is accept that how we see the world and what we think and how we act is not completely of God. That it is most likely, mostly of the world. We're not bad because of that, but it is the way that we are formed, which is why we do things like this. That's why we come to Bible study, or we come to church, or we pray, or we journal and reflect. It's in order to try to shift us closer to God. We might be 90% in the world. Can we get to 85%? Maybe 80%? I mean, we may not ever get to beyond halfway toward God, but can we get a little closer? Of course we can. It doesn't matter where we are and how long we have lived and what we have done. We can always move closer to God. It's not about where you are on that spectrum. It's about how you're moving. It's one way or the other. Move this way, over to God. It's good for us. Okay, questions or thoughts on that? Yes, sir.
So, is what you're saying then perhaps at the basis of Jesus' insistence that we need to become like little children? In other words, is he saying, if you want to be able to really hear my message, you need to strip away these decades and decades and decades of self-aggrandizement and kind of listen to me like you just didn't ask.
Yeah, so the question being, when Jesus says, faithfulness like little children, is that really what he's saying? That we need to kind of strip away all of the stuff that we have accumulated over our lifetime? It's an excellent image. I think that we can often romanticize children a little much. Children, I think, are much more, it is easier for children to accept God's impact or God's presence and respond to it. But let's not make no mistakes. Children are not like 100% in the right. People often say things like, "Oh, children don't see color. Children don't see poverty. Children, I mean, you put children together, they'll play together." That's kind of BS. I mean, children are nicer than adults on the whole. Sure, they are a little, but they're not as courageous as many adults I know. Children are often kind of skittish. They prefer what they know over what they don't know. They haven't learned yet that there's a bit of confidence they can have in the world that I think many adults often gather over time. Not all adults, but I do think that in the very simplest way, like don't take the metaphor too far, but if we look at it as saying children are simply not yet fully baked, it's easier for children who are still kind of, I imagine it's like if you're making a cake. Every time you combine ingredients, it gets harder to separate those ingredients again. So children are kind of like in process. They're sort of like, they're still dry and wet ingredients in two different bowls. They haven't quite put them together yet. Well, most of us in here, like the cake is baked. I mean, it's being iced, right? I mean, the roses are going on top. It's really difficult now to go back to the whole egg in the bowl. The younger a child is, sort of the more whole and pure that experience is. But children doesn't mean 17-year-olds. Children probably really means like really, really young, toddler age. I mean, even 8-year-olds are practically in the oven. So, we need to strip a lot of that stuff away and understand that children, by the time they're talking, they're being formed. What is the language that they're using? How do they describe the world? Who do they see in their world? How comfortable are they outside of the little familial bubble in which they're raised? I mean, all of those things, that's one of the reasons why I think we have to take our children and send them out into the world to do service projects and outreach and to introduce themselves to people. I love when children get to be around others who really don't look like them, because regardless of whether they're almost entirely like them, so much is based on the way people look that it just keeps them open to kind of the brilliance of all of humanity rather than just the lane that they happen to have been born into. And the wider that can be, the longer, I think the better a person is over time. When stuff is so very clear and tight too early, it creates enough fear that you never quite expand outside of your own self. And that's not what I see in the Bible as God's hope for us. Not at all. Any other comments or thoughts? All right, so I do want to talk for just one moment before we continue on about, just a little bit more about discernment. So part of what we see here in this is the word discern. That is really important. I use the phrase knowledge of good or evil. The word knowledge, discernment, it's basically the same root word. Knowledge, though, implies you just know something. Something is or is not. Discernment implies more of a process. And that's really what this Hebrew word is saying. It's not about a nice big spreadsheet where this column is all the good and this column is all the evil. And once you've identified everything, then you're done. That's not it. Really, nothing is ever absolutely good or absolutely evil. Part of faithfulness with God is that discernment. And that makes us uncomfortable. I'm just going to name it right now. We don't like that stuff. Most humans like things to be clear. If something is good, it is good all the time. If something is evil, it is evil all the time. And if something is good, it can't be evil. And if something is evil, it can't be good. That's not what God presents. God's world is totally fluid. In other words, God's world is totally gray. That's grace. I mean, if we want to talk about what grace really is, grace is that anything can be made good again. So that means nothing is ever fully evil. Can a moment be evil or an action be evil? Sure it can. Can a person only ever be evil? Never. That's annoying, because it would be so much easier to be able to say, this person has now done a thing that makes them evil forever, and they are done. Like, we put them in the box, we don't have to look at them again, we don't have to care about them again, they're gone, bye. And that just cleans up the world very nicely. And that can be anything. And I don't even mean things that are legal or illegal. I'm not even talking about that. I'm just talking about if someone hurts you. Like, could someone hurt you so much that they're done? The answer, God's answer, is no. That is not necessarily judgment. It's just simply the inconvenience of love and grace. What Solomon asks for here is the capacity to discern. I don't want us to imagine that that simply means knowing what is right and wrong. Discernment is a constant, active way of being where you open yourself up to the flexibility that something that used to be right might now be wrong. Something that used to be wrong might now be right. Man, that's a mess. But it's God's mess. It's the way it is. And whether we like it or not does not change that God actually has set it up that way. And so I guess my pastoral word to you is deal with it. So God is really messy and gray. And it takes energy for us to try all the time to discern what God is doing. That really gets to the root of what redemption is all about. Nothing that you've heard me say this before, nothing we've done and nothing we will do can separate us from God. That means that sort of discernment is constant, ongoing, all the time. And we're part of it. We should be part of it. God wants us to be part of it. God wants us to wrestle with these ideas for our entire lives and not to simply settle into a groove and be thoughtless or careless. And I know it's like exhausting to think about how there are things that we would like to have settled that might not actually be settled in God's eyes, but I didn't write the Bible. So, we just have to kind of take it for what it is and be willing to put some energy into that sort of discernment, which is why remaining active in religion is important. There's a difference between spirituality and faithfulness and religion. Religion is the active engagement of faith. It's not once and done. It's active all the time, hopefully daily, hopefully hourly. Hopefully there is always this engagement all the time, opening ourselves up to what God's trying to reveal and how God is inviting us to discern. Okay, I'm good. Questions or comments about that? Okay, deep breath. Now let's go to an easier section. Let's look at verse 16. This is the second part of today's lesson. We're going to talk about the wise judgment. This is a story that I certainly remember as a child. My guess is that most of us could have pulled this story, at least some version of it, right out of our heads. But let's read it, because it's good stuff. Verse 16. 2 women who were prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, "Please, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth while she was in the house. Then on the 3rd day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth. We were together. There was no one else with us in the house. Only the 2 of us were in the house. Then this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him," which is tragic. She got up in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while your servant slept. She laid him at her breast and laid her dead son at my breast. When I rose in the morning to nurse my son, I saw that he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, clearly it was not the son I had borne. But the other woman said, no, the living son is mine and the dead son is yours. The first said, no, the dead son is yours and the living son is mine. So they argued before the king. Then the king said, the one says, this is my son that is alive and your son is dead. While the other says, not so, your son is dead and my son is a living one. So the king said, bring me a sword. And they brought a sword before the king. The king said, divide the living boy in two, then give half to the one and half to the other. But the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because compassion for her son burned within her, please, my lord, give her the living boy. Certainly, do not kill him. The other said, it shall be neither mine nor yours. Divide it. Then the king responded, give the first woman the living boy. Do not kill him. She is his mother. All Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to execute justice. So Solomon's judgment is absolutely apparent as soon as he says it. I mean, I think if we're all tracking, imagine you're reading this story for the very first time. When he says, bring me a sword, I think we all know, like, oh my gosh, I know what's going to happen. And sure enough, what happens is what we would imagine would happen. Brilliant. I remember the first time I heard this story, I thought, what a stunner. That is such a smart way to judge who is the actual mother of this living boy. After all, at this point in time, they're not taking a maternity test. There's no DNA test. You kind of just, it's her word against her word. And as soon as Solomon says, cut the boy in half and give each woman a half, like, you know exactly what's going to happen. Now, of course, the true mother would not let her son be killed. She'd rather the child be raised away from her and still be alive than to be raised with her directly. What a hardship that would be. But I think everyone can imagine this. Certainly if you had a child, you understand you would rather your child be raised away from you and raised well than raised with or to be killed, essentially. And so the biological mother here has made that kind of hard choice. Solomon's wisdom and understanding, compassion, allowed him to make this judgment. Now, compassion is an interesting word because in Hebrew, compassion is the same root word as womb. And so there is something fundamentally maternal about being compassionate. And so as the storyteller says this, we hear that phrase there. Let me see. It's verse 26. The woman whose son was alive said to the king, and then we have an aside, because compassion for her son burned within her. That word really means she feels it. It is like a physical connection that she has, which I will say, although I have never been a woman bearing a child, I think if you have been a woman bearing a child, you probably get that feeling. I remember reading somewhere back when my oldest was still in the womb, saying that women become mothers when they get pregnant, and men become fathers when they hold the baby. So there is something like physical that connects us, and women have that moment even before birth. There is that connection, that physical connection. That compassion is not just a feeling in Hebrew. Compassion is that physical connectedness that a mother has with her child. Let's note what isn't here in this story. Because let me pause and say, any just general questions about the judgment or the way that that story functions? Because I want to talk about what isn't noted in this story. But let's talk about what is there first. Any thoughts or questions after you read this? It's pretty straightforward. Okay, let's talk about what isn't here. Now we hear that these two women are prostitutes, and it's just like a passing comment. Nothing is really said about them. However, because these women are prostitutes, we can glean a few things about the current social state of Israel. Although David seemed to do a decent amount of unifying, and Solomon seems to have a lot of authority, the world in which most Israelites live is still not that great. No women seek out prostitution if there are other good ways of making a living. So if these two women, who are prostitutes, have been forced to take that line of work, there must be some social and economic problems in the system. Otherwise, they would not be doing this. And so although it's not said, we can glean that Solomon has yet to kind of clean up the general social order of Israel. Now, I mean, no judgment, because what culture really has cleaned up their social order so much so that prostitution isn't really present? Very few. Certainly not ours. And so we understand that this complex issue is one that is just untouched in this narrative. They just are named as prostitutes, and we move on. What's also I find interesting about this story is that apparently the woman who's not the child's biological mother is perfectly fine cutting this child in half. What? How weird is that? I mean, one might think that neither would wish the child to be cut in half, but it isn't even unsaid in this. The second woman says, "It shall be neither mine nor yours, divide it." Dang, that's cold. I mean, that woman is, in whatever reason, is just fine having no children. We might perceive or interpret that moment as this other prostitute is uncaring or angry or grieving or any number of things. I mean, she just lost her own baby, remember. There's also an interesting dynamic here that could potentially mean, I mean, imagine if you are a prostitute, what is the great inconvenience to your way of life? A baby. And if these women are living together, could it actually be easier if they didn't have their babies? This second woman obviously kind of wants a child, or else she would not have gone to get the other woman's child. But there is this callousness that the woman displays, wishing for the child to be cut in half, that I suppose we can at least wonder about. I have no answer. But it does strike me as a little odd that we would have had that moment in this judgment first. It would have been enough for the biological mother to have said, "Stop, don't cut him in half." And then Solomon would have known it's her. But we get this added bit where the other woman has to say, "Yep, cut him." And that just seems very strange. But it is what it is. All right. Any questions or comments about the entire judgment story before we move on to chapter 4? Yes?
I think it's a little odd that two prostitutes would get to go to that level of the king.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So the question being, isn't it a bit odd that two seemingly random prostitutes have taken their relatively small dispute all the way in front of the king? And I mean, of course, that seems totally out of scope, that this would have just been settled. I mean, honestly, I just imagine they would have fought together in their house, and the woman, who's obviously not very great, would have probably stabbed the other woman. I don't know. But anyway, we get this story because Solomon is supposed to be so very wise in his judgment. So honestly, it's not about the women as much as it is about Solomon's brilliance. I certainly know if you were to have presented this case to me, I would not have proceeded the way Solomon did. How efficient. I mean, just how sharp, no pun intended, that Solomon would have said, well, we could have heard lots of testimony. We could have looked at the children and like, does he look like you? Does he look like you? I mean, he could have done a whole bunch of number of things. Solomon's like, get a sword. And within a minute, problem solved. I think it's much more about Solomon. So I guess perhaps the root of your question is, did this actually happen? Like, would it have actually happened that two prostitutes would have come in front of Solomon? It's an interesting question because I can't say no. Israel isn't that big. We think of Israel, I mean, I don't know exactly what you think of when you think of Israel. I tend to think of Israel as like modern Israel. Even modern Israel is not that big, but modern Israel is way bigger than ancient Israel. You are talking about hundreds and thousands of people, not hundreds of thousands and millions of people. So the scale of the total number of people is completely different. So could a random couple women actually come before the king? Well, just mathematically speaking, maybe, because there aren't millions of people. There aren't even hundreds of thousands of people, probably. Could be. But you're really talking about a relatively small group of people. And if you're thinking of a total percentage of the population that's having some kind of big conflict on any given day, it's likely not a lot of them. That being said, this is almost certainly a story that was added to exemplify Solomon. This is akin, I imagine this is akin to the gospel passage. I don't think I've ever said this to you all in here, so just like prepare yourselves. I'm sorry if I ruined your day. But the story of the prostitute who was about to be stoned in John, where Jesus draws a line and says, you without sin cast the first stone, that's not original. I mean, we can prove that story was added in by some scribe who was just copying John. Now, does that mean it's not a good story? It's a great story. It's not original. John didn't write it. I kind of say whatever, because I think it's totally in line with what Jesus would have done. But I imagine this story of the two women coming in front of Solomon could kind of be like that story, where someone along the line heard a good story and decided to attribute that story to Solomon. It may not have been his story in the beginning. I would venture a guess to say that story about Jesus drawing a line in the sand may not have been Jesus, but someone said, man, it sure sounds like what Jesus would do. Yeah, it does. And so someone just put it right in and attributed it to Jesus. That's kind of the way these books were written over time. We often kind of absentmindedly apply some purist theory to them, but they're not quite as pure as we think they are. They're just really meant to help us, discern what God really wants. And so my guess is that this was a story people liked that was just thrown in there. Was it actually Solomon? I don't know. But it sure does sound good if it's attributed to Solomon. Any other thoughts or questions? Yes?
So, you may have said this before, was Kings written by the priests in Babylon that were in exile?
Was Kings written by the priests in Babylon? Yes, mostly. Most of these books would have been written by people in exile, finalized after the exile. And so that's a great example of the bulk of the structure of the story would have been written even before, but certainly during the exile. But then it wouldn't have been finalized with maybe a few of these additions until they were back. Because essentially the priestly class is trying to create a standard by which everyone will live their life. And they come out of exile as the leaders. They've had 70 years, which is multiple generations, to consider the way that they wish the Jewish people to live right so that the exile never happens again. And I preached about this a couple weeks ago, but they come back and there are still lots of Jews. Most of the Jews were not in exile. And so some of those Jews who had stayed down in Israel for the 70 years of the exile kind of bought into what the priests brought back from Babylon with them. Most of the Jews didn't. And so when we get to the first century and we're reading about the Gospels, when there are multiple different kinds of Jews, including people like the Samaritans, the reason all those different kinds of Jews exist is because of these different moments in time where history shifts for one group, not all of them. And so Pharisees, Sadducees, they're the post-exile Jews who brought all the laws back with them. Samaritans, those are the Jews that didn't go into exile. The Essenes, where John the Baptist was out by the Jordan River, those are Jews that broke away from the Pharisees and the Sadducees because they saw what they were doing as different than what God wished them to do, which is why John the Baptist is one of the preachers that called people out of Jerusalem down to the Jordan River to do something different. And then on and on and on. We don't get all of the different Jewish groups, but there were many of them. We can almost understand them as denominations. Not exactly, but for the sake of basic understanding, it's kind of like different Christian denominations, where all the different Jewish groups who anchor themselves at different points in time and history and place for their primary identity. Other questions? All right, let's end today with the very beginning of chapter 4, and then we're going to do chapter 4 and 5, or the rest of chapter 4 and 5 next week. So we're going to introduce the idea of Solomon's court. First few verses of chapter 4, I'm just going to read verses 1, 2, and 7 to just give us an idea here. Chapter 4, verse 1, 2, and then 7. King Solomon was king over all Israel, and then these were his high officials. I'm not going to read all of those names. It's a bunch of names from different places. Then look at verse 7. Solomon had 12 officials over all Israel who provided food for the king and his household. Each one had to make provision for 1 month in the year. So let me translate. There were 12 nobles. Each one would raise up support for King Solomon and his household for 1 month out of the year. So in other words, these people had to create a structure in which they were able to support all of Solomon's court, all his expenses, all his largesse for 1 month out of the year. What is interesting about this is that before Israel had a king, Samuel represented one of the arguments against a king, and that was that the king would be very expensive. Having a king means having a court. And having a court means having lots of people, and having a whole lot of people who don't do anything productive to grow food or shepherd animals or clean water or build buildings means someone else is going to have to do it for them. And so you create a tiered structure where all of a sudden all the people at the bottom no longer have to only feed themselves, build their own houses, watch out for their family. They've got to do more than only what they need, so that you've got support that filters up to the people at the top tier who aren't doing anything productive. They're just being. And now we see the realization of Samuel's warning. Samuel told the people, hey, right now, you're just taking care of yourself. I mean, you've got your household, you've got your kids, you've got your extended family. You grow the food, you shepherd the animals, you get your own water, you do all that stuff. If we have a king, you're going to have to start being more than 100% productive in order to pass some of that benefit up the chain. Solomon embodies Samuel's warning spectacularly. Solomon, as we will see next week, has a very large court and has a very large harem, has a lot of children, and plus all the other people who take care of it. And all of those people need support from Israel. And we create this hierarchical structure that did not need to exist without a king. And it is formalized under Solomon in a very impactful way. And we will pick that up next week. Good to see you all. Have a wonderful day.